Well, there was an extraordinary author on Coast to Coast AM, David Paulides. I'm sure a lot of you heard the program. I certainly did. I was absolutely riveted, and I wanted immediately to have David on Dreamland, and he's here with us today. David's book, Missing 411, Western United States and Canada, available now from his website, kanammissing.com. The Eastern United States, out later this month. Very exciting and extraordinary stuff. We're going to go deeper into some new cases that have just developed over the course of Dreamland. And for subscribers, we're going to get into some very, very extraordinary new material, new evidence involving Bigfoot, suggesting Bigfoot may not be a great ape at all. And also for subscribers, David and I are going to talk about one of the most incredible missing persons cases in all of history. It took place in Indonesia a few years ago. You can read about it on unknowncountry.com. Just follow the links on the Dreamland page. And for you subscribers, you can listen to me talking to Alan Lammers, who was a direct witness of this extraordinary case in Indonesia. Now, I'm very excited to introduce David Paulides to my Dreamland audience. David, welcome to this radio program. And I'd like to start with one of the strangest cases. It's been ongoing for a number of years, of feet found in shoes, just feet, on the shores of British Columbia. David, could you tell us a little bit more about these cases?
Well, British Columbia is a unique location because there have been literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have disappeared there along a route called the Highway of Tears. It's in the interior of British Columbia. And it wasn't until just recently that the RCMP put a task force together to really look at the issue. And many people have disappeared hitchhiking, some in their front lawn area, some in the forest. Along the coastal route, there's been many disappearances along the same sort of format. But along the coast of British Columbia down all the way to Northern California, there have been feet found in shoes, predominantly in tennis shoes. And I don't know that the RCMP really has a good handle on this yet. There have been rumors that these are suicides, but it seems odd that just feet in shoes are showing up. And again, I don't know.
Well, what a strange thing to decide. Suicide? What? Feet in shoes and they're suicides?
It seems odd, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I would say so. The theory being what? Why did just their feet show up after they committed suicide?
You know, no one said. It seems like it was just a flippant response, maybe to soothe the public about the issue. But I think that the best that I've heard is that one shoe and one foot was identified, and that belonged to somebody who was quote-unquote despondent, but there was no words of suicide with this person, and interestingly, they didn't even name the person, so very little information is out there about this.
That's really, really strange, and yet has it happened in the past year or so at all, or?
I think the last shoe was just about a year ago, found on the Northern California coast up near Crescent City.
Yeah. You know, you're talking to somebody who worries a lot about disappearances for obvious reasons, having been involved with this strange phenomena for so long. Well, let's go back to the Highway of Tears. And if this has been going on now for quite a long time along this specific stretch of road in British Columbia, is that correct?
Yes.
Well, interestingly enough, there was one of the most carefully documented alien abductions that ever happened was quite near there in the Okanagan. So you have to wonder what is actually going on out there. Tell us a little bit about some of the cases along the highway.
You know, many are First Nations people, and to me that's an interesting phenomenon because I've always been interested in Native Americans and their culture and their legends and things. And these people tend to be comfortable out in the wild or out in the wilderness or along a roadway alone where maybe you and I wouldn't be. Maybe that makes them more susceptible. Maybe it doesn't. Many of these victims have been women. There's literally been almost no witnesses. There's been a lot of rumors that they may have a suspect on one or two of these cases and maybe a serial predator. I think they're hoping for a big break on the case, but I think in reality there's very little information. And when you look on these serial cases, these people don't talk to others. They're very quiet about what they do for obvious reasons. They're unique people. A lot of times they're good-looking people. So if it is a serial predator, you know, they could be good for 20 or 30 of these. But again, these numbers are high. I think in some instances along that could be attributed to this highway of tears, it could be upwards of 60, 70 people.
That would make it one of the most terrible of all serial killer cases in world history, actually. It would be right up there with the top.
Absolutely.
And how long has it been going on?
I believe it's been going on over 20 years.
Well, that's very scary and very, very weird. One of the things about the book, bureaucrats make my blood boil, and I'm not alone in this, in the world. In fact, when people are actually bureaucrats, I think they conceal their jobs so that they won't get attacked by almost anyone they see. But bureaucrats have had quite a role to play in your effort to get into this and to understand what is actually happening in our national park system. Could you describe a little bit about your experiences with the National Park Service?
And here in Whitley goes to the heart of what these two books are about. Several years ago, I got some information about disappearances in the park system. A couple of people told me that they had worked at several different parks and they had seen people go missing, and they thought that the Park Service was being maybe not as reticent and not as forward, maybe holding back information to the public as they should be as a public agency, and they thought that there seemed to be too many of these disappearances in certain locations. And they said that somebody really needs to take a hard look at this. Well, we did, and there were four of us that worked on this for a little over 3 years. First thing we did was one of the parks closest to me is Yosemite. Been going there my whole life. I understand it. I also understand there's been a lot of disappearances there, some really unusual disappearances. So we filed the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, against the Park Service asking for a list of missing people from Yosemite. And I'm not the greatest writer in the world, but I tend to get my point across. And the Park Service came back and stated that they didn't have any lists of missing people. Well, one of the people that I work with is the head of a large statewide law enforcement jurisdiction. This guy has over 40 years of law enforcement experience. He's a former director. He knows his stuff. When we got this letter back, this guy said, "Dave, these people are not stupid. They have lists. Try rewriting it a different way so you can get around any semantical issues, but you know they have the lists." We rewrote it, sent it back. The Western Regional Director for FOIA for the Park Service came back and said, "No, Dave, we understood your request. We have no list of missing people. We don't have them at the park level, and we don't have them at the national level for all the parks." And I said, "Well, how can that be, a politically sensitive issue like this?" And her response, and I quote it in the book, is that we rely on the institutional memory of our employees to help us on missing people and to understand the magnitude of it at different parks. So I thought, oh, perfect. So I sent a request back again saying that I was a published author and I requested an exemption and I wanted the list of missing people utilizing what you just quoted. I got a response back that they would have to go into the archives and form a list, and it would cost me $34,000 for the list from Yosemite.
Just from Yosemite?
Just Yosemite.
Which means it must be a fairly big list. I mean, $34,000 is a lot of money, but you're going to be talking millions of dollars for the rest of the country. Am I right?
$1.4 million for the entire park system.
Now, isn't this astonishing irresponsibility on the part of the Park Service to not keep lists of missing people? And if they do keep secret lists, then the fact that those lists are secret is putting the Park Service ahead of the lives of its own patrons. They care more about the Park Service than they do about the people who go to the parks.
So the Park Service knew what was coming because we filed probably 50 FOIAs against them in the last 3.5, 4 years on various people that have disappeared, on lists like this, etc. They knew what we were doing. So it's a calculated decision on their part to hold back on those lists. Apparently, and we discussed this at length, apparently the fallout from what we're talking about right now and what I've talked about on other shows must be less than the fallout would be if they released those lists.
Well, of course it is, because if they released the lists, then the public would know to take the kind of simple precautions that you suggest in the book. When you say a transponder, by the way, you suggest hiking the parks and so forth and so on in pairs, and you suggest the use of a transponder. What do you mean by a transponder?
Well, years ago, the first transponders that were out, my dad had a plane and we used to carry it, and it looked like a giant kind of hand phone. And if the plane ever crashed in the wilderness, my dad taught us, hey, sometimes the crash itself would set off the transponder. It goes to a satellite and it tells search and rescue officials that a plane crashed, and they'll hone in on the signal and find you. The same sort of technology exists for hikers in the wilderness now, and it's so cost effective at this point that anyone could really go out and buy one for $100. And if you get hurt or you're injured, you could just press the transponder and eventually you get found. Now, the interesting thing about that, out of all the cases I ever researched, there was only one guy that disappeared. He was found in a really, really weird area, and they found him because of that transponder. It didn't save his life, but they did find him, and I don't think they ever would have found this guy without it. And it's a really, really rare event when two people, especially two adults, disappear simultaneously. And I think that there must be some rationale to that. So hiking together, using a transponder, I think covers a lot more of those bases and gives you a better chance of getting found alive than not.
Well, yeah. Tell us about this. Where was this man found?
So on the outskirts of Yosemite, there's several different wilderness areas. And for the people who have never been there, there's a lot of spires, crags, cliffy areas. So right before the transponder goes off, a storm comes into the area, and I mean there's lightning, rain, etc. And anyone who's a hiker knows you don't go up to the top of peaks and mountains, especially during a thunderstorm in the mountains. That's the worst place to go.
Right.
Not only did this guy go to the top of the mountain, it was not only raining and thundering, but he did, and then he ended up in the bottom of one of these crags, spires, in a small little tiny valley where the chances of being found by a search and rescue team without that transponder are zero. And the only reason they did find him is because a search plane with a transponder receiver flew exactly over the spot and was able to pick him up. It was very unusual.
Well, yeah, because what in the world was he doing there? Storms play a surprising role in this, just in general. Is that correct?
An amazing part in all of this. It almost seems as though there's some intellect involved at some level where right before or right after the person disappears, there's a major storm, and sometimes these storms go on for days. And
yeah, that is very creepy. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, it does cause obvious troubles for the search and rescue teams, but it seems that it happens more times than not. And in researching hundreds of these cases, it's something that just keeps raising its head every time, and it's weird.
Yeah, I should say so, because it's almost like there's somebody who can cause the storms, dare I say that, in order to cover the tracks?
Well, we thought about that, and then we thought the other thing is that there's certain animals and there's obviously fish that understand changes in barometric pressure. And maybe there was a time in our lives way back when where we could as well, but maybe it's that change in barometric pressure that somehow something somewhere realizes that a storm's about to come. I don't know.
It's absolutely eerie. Folks, when we get back, we're going to talk about a new case that has just started to develop, the Micah True case. It's quite remarkable case. When we get back with Dave Paulides, Missing 411, and you can get more deeply into this if you're concerned about a missing person or you want to protect yourself by being careful about where you go. Go to canammissing.com, canammissing.com. We'll be right back.
Dreamland subscribers, don't miss the live chat with Whitley Strieber in the Unknown Country chat rooms Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific Time.
Beyond the live chats in the unknowncountry.com subscriber section, which are themselves great and a lot of fun, we also offer a huge archive going back all the way to 2004. In this archive is an absolutely fascinating Dreamland with Alan Lammers about missing persons in Indonesia. It is hair-curling, so maybe now is the time for you to go to unknowncountry.com, click on that subscribe tab, and subscribe now. $12.95 brings you 3 months. It's one of the least expensive and very best subscription offerings of its kind online. Do it today. You've been listening to this show for a long time. Now, do a little give back. Get on board. It's fun, and it gives you a great feeling to know you're helping Unknown Country and Dreamland keep on keeping on. I've been thinking about attending the Dreamland Festival. You better hurry and get your tickets. We're down to just 28 seats left, so it's time to make your decision. And if you're an unknowncountry.com subscriber, you get an additional 10% off. Very well worth doing. Wondering what a festival is like. Now let's listen to what a participant in an earlier Dreamland Festival thought about what it was like there. Tell us about the presentations, why don't you?
It's almost like the presentations took on a three-dimensional quality that you just don't get when you're reading this material. To have the person presenting it live gives it a level of intricacy that you don't get when you're just reading a book, and also to be able to ask questions on the spot is, again, it's invaluable.
The Dreamland Festival, as unique as this programming, as unique as the people who make Dreamland happen, as unique as unknowncountry.com. Don't miss it this year. Go to unknowncountry.com, click on the store tab, get your tickets today.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We go deeper.
This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Dave Paulides. We're talking to him about missing persons. He did an extraordinary show on Coast to Coast AM a few nights ago. I listened to every word of it, and I was riveted. And we're going a little deeper today on Dreamland into this whole issue. And for subscribers, we're going to be talking about some very, very strange stuff. Bigfoot, possible alien abductions, an intelligence behind this, or just exactly what is it that is causing all of these very, very strange cases. Before we left the air, I was just mentioning the case, Dave, I'm sure of Micah True. Tell us a little bit about Micah and his background.
Micah was a long-distance cross-country marathoner who was in phenomenal shape. This guy made a career out of running the backwoods, mountains, country roads of Mexico and the U.S., and he had worldwide fame for his age. He was 58, but he probably looked 40 or younger. He was running in the Gila, G-I-L-A wilderness.
Right.
And he disappeared. And he and his family were staying at a nearby lodge. And normally, Mika took his dog with him when he ran, and for some reason today, or that day, he didn't. And he had ran these woods dozens of times before, so he knew them. And he didn't come back in his normal time, and people started to look for him. And up until just recently, they hadn't let go with much information about it, other than he had disappeared. They found his body near a creek. Well, just recently, more information has come out. They stated that they found him half sitting, half in the creek, half on the bank. One shoe was off. There were severe bruises and scratches on his body, and an autopsy is pending. So if you read my books, this is a really, really common scenario to find somebody who had been missing, meaning shoe or both shoes are gone or off their feet. Second thing is that there's severe scratching or bruising on the body. They're found in an area they're not supposed to be. And the entire scenario really, on its surface, doesn't fit the mold of any common sense based on the person's profile.
And the feet, the strange thing about the feet, I have to tell you that a creepy feeling went off my spine when I read about this in the latest stories about it, because I thought immediately of the feet being found in shoes on the coast of British Columbia. And I thought, is there some kind of bizarre connection here? What could be going on? It's almost as if there is something doing this. Could it be insane? Well, obviously, I mean, you just have to wonder.
You can get a lot more accomplished sitting around talking as a group of people than one person sitting in the room alone. And we've all known researchers that work alone. And I learned a long time ago when I worked on teams on the police department that solving big issues, you need a bunch of free thinkers sitting together talking about it. And luckily, in our group, we've got that. And one of the guys came up with the idea and said, well, if you were in the middle of the wilderness and somebody took your shoes, you're limited in how fast you're going to run and how far you're going to go. And I thought, wow, that's a good thought.
That's right. So maybe that somebody is trapping them by taking their shoes.
It was one thought that was come up with, and I have no idea.
So odd. Dave, I want to go on now and to start talking a little bit about some of these clusters, and to tell us where the clusters are taking place, if you will.
So first of all, we really don't know all of the missing people in the park systems because they won't tell us. But what we did do is we went out to many of these locations, sat in libraries near the parks, and scoured archives trying to understand the magnitude of it. And you can't find everything everywhere, and I know we didn't, I'll admit it, but we did find the biggest cluster in the Park Service we could find is Yosemite. Yeah, and they have some of the most bizarre disappearances you will ever find anywhere. But one of the more troubling places that we found a cluster of disappearances was Crater Lake National Park. And what bothers me about that as being a dad of a son and daughter is that there's a group of missing boys, 10 and under, in remote areas of Crater Lake that don't make any sense at all. These boys disappeared in a remote region where you can't imagine that a serial predator would be sitting around behind a tree waiting to grab somebody and take them, because that's almost as though something similar to that has to be taken that we just don't understand, because these boys disappeared in places where cars can't really get to in most instances. They disappear so quickly it's beyond any rational understanding of what it could be. There's a consistency to it. If you go further north in the Cascade Mountain Range, there's another cluster of boys missing in the North Cascades just south of the Canadian border in Washington. Again, in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere, these kids have disappeared. And the strange thing about these boys that disappear is they are never found, which is really an uncommon thing if you look at the magnitude of search and rescue. Most people are found eventually. These boys are never found. So there's 28 clusters that we've identified in the United States and Canada. There's an area right in the middle of the U.S. where there are absolutely no clusters, which is an unusual feat. It's almost as though there's a demilitarized zone in the U.S.
How strange. And, we're going to take another little break here, and when we get back, we'll talk about the significance of that area and exactly what makes it different from the rest of the country. We'll be right back. One of the most popular members of the Dreamland team is Jim Marrs, and Jim's got, just listen to what he's got planned.
Howdy. Be my pleasure to tell all my fans and friends about who or what is trying to gain control over the earth. The leaders of the New World Order make it very plain that they want to reduce the world's population. So now, wait a minute. Why would you want to wreck the environment and kill off everybody on the planet, which is the mainstay of wealth and power, unless we have to ask ourselves, are they even us? I'll present some really interesting evidence to show that thousands of years ago, by many, many compelling accounts, there were extraterrestrials, or at least non-humans. Well, did they all leave, or are they still here? We'll explore that question when I talk at the Dreamland Festival.
This gives us just a taste of what Jim Marrs' next book is going to be about, the occulting of America. At the Dreamland Festival, you'll find out more. Go to unknowncountry.com, click on the sales point for the Dreamland Festival on the upper right, and get your tickets today. This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Dave Paulides about his book and two books, Missing 411. You can get to Dave at his website, canammissing.com, CANAMMISSING.com. He's also got an absolutely terrific Bigfoot research website, nabigfootresearch.com. He's one of the premier Bigfoot researchers in the country. Now, David, when we left the air, we were starting to talk about the central United States and the fact that there's very little of this in the central part of the country. And what about a place like Texas? Has got a lot of wilderness, a lot of treacherous wilderness.
So specifically, Texas and Florida were excluded from the book because, honestly, I could write 2 volumes on Texas and on Florida. There are that many missing people from those 2 states under very unusual circumstances. So this manuscript, when I finished, was so large that we had to split it between the western U.S., which was released in early March, the eastern U.S., which will be released in April. So right now, Florida and Texas are not included.
So you literally can't include them, and it doesn't surprise me too much, being from Texas as I am. I know the state really well, and I've been in some pretty hairy areas, but I'll bet there are cases in Texas and in Florida, I'm sure there would be in both states, which have got very dense, deep wildernesses, which are quite spectacularly strange. And I wonder if you can tell us about any particular cases that might jump to mind from these 2 states.
You know, Whitley, it's so hard to keep track of the 411 we did in the West and the East that I honestly kind of purged those Texas and Florida cases out of my mind. And I had a difficult enough time just trying to keep track of the 411 I wrote about.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, fine. I can certainly understand that. So we've got plenty of cases to talk about. Being from Texas, I was immediately interested. But you said that there was a large part of the central United States where this doesn't seem to be happening. And tell us a little bit about what parts of the country seem safe from this.
Well, I always hate the word safe, but mainly I would start with western Oklahoma, say anywhere from just east of Oklahoma City going all the way west. then going almost straight north from there, all the way up through North Dakota, South Dakota, right through the heart of the U.S. And I mean, in both books, I include a very small map of the U.S. that shows the clusters, but you can see that almost right down the middle of the U.S., there's nothing, and it's really odd.
Well, you know, I know western Oklahoma and the Dakotas also pretty well. I've been out in the wilderness a good bit, and, you know, those places are wild, just as wild as West Texas. Wilder, in fact, the Dakotas.
Absolutely.
So, what's the deal?
I wish I understood.
Yeah, it would be very reassuring, but I think maybe I'm going to confine my hiking from now on to the Black Hills.
Yeah.
The Black Hills are a wild place, and you're saying there's not much there in terms of disappearances?
You know, not that fit the criteria of what we were looking for. And again, it's the disappearance without a witness, and the person, or there is evidence of other similar disappearances in that immediate area. There's no disappearance that we cited that was in relationship or could be associated with a criminal event per se. Also, none of the disappearances could deal with a possibility that water took the people away. If I can diverge for a second, there's a story we talked about in the Rocky Mountain National Park, an individual named Alfred Beelarts that disappeared in 1930. And Alfred was a very small boy, 2 years old, and he was camping with his mom and dad along a river in the middle of the national park. And how they were starting to walk up the side of the river, and Alfred got behind his parents just a little bit, and he disappeared. And the parents Alfred was 4 years old. This was in 7/2/1938. Alfred, his parents thought he fell into the river, but they weren't sure, and they didn't think so because they would have heard something, because this isn't a huge river. And the Park Service came out, and immediately they focused on the water, as is normal in search and rescue.
Right.
And they went to the point of getting permission to shut down the river. They dammed it, and they searched under every boulder going downstream for 3.5 miles. They didn't find anything. So then they think, well, maybe we ought to start looking on the land. So a couple days later, they bring in some canines, and they track it uphill, which is weird, because if you know anything about search and rescue, small children and most people walk downhill when they're lost. Well, they went uphill. Canines went uphill for about 1,000 feet. They stopped at a fork in the trail, and the dogs sat down and said, well, that's enough. We're not going any further, which is odd canine behavior. And the other thing you'll find in a lot of these cases is that dogs, whether they're dogs with the people that disappear or dogs that return after the people have disappeared, or the response from bloodhounds, canines, and search dogs, the dogs play a predominant role in many of these disappearances, and the behavior is very unusual. So these dogs sit down. Well, unbeknownst to everybody, about 2,500 feet further up the mountain, there's a husband and wife that are backpacking. And one morning they wake up and they thought they saw something or heard something about 750 feet above them on a rock ledge. They both look up and they see a little boy walk out to a rock ledge, and they're looking at it and they can't believe it. And they only see him for 5 to 10 seconds, and then the boy turns around and walks back off the ledge, and he's gone. And these people know exactly where this boy was at, and they said there's no way this kid could have gotten to that location without assistance in some means. Well, they didn't know that Alfred had disappeared. They didn't know there was a huge search party until they got home, until Denver, read the newspapers. They drive back to the park the following day, and they tell authorities what they saw. And they were shown a picture, and they said, yeah, that was Alfred in their mind. Search parties go up there, and the location where Alfred was seen is a place called Devil's Nest. And I write in the book, and I say that locations in mountains, just like names of lakes, hilltops, ridges, they get these names for a reason.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that question, the way the word devil comes into the names of so many of these places. It's like, yeah, they do get where do the names come from, do you think?
Well, I go back to Native Americans, and and history and explorers, travelers. But many times these locations, there's something unusual, or there's some unexplained act that occurs there, obviously, that, or maybe there's something evil that's found there. Maybe a hunter's found and it appears something evil happened to them. It's hard to know why these locations get their names, but as you can see in the stories, that word devil comes up too often.
Too often, exactly. So it goes back then.
Oh, it goes back.
But let's go back to this
best I can
case.
tell.
Let's not drop the. Let's go finish this case. It's an incredible case.
So the searchers, 40 people, scour this mountainside for 3 days, and they don't find anything of this boy or any remnants that he was there. Now, as I go further, and I'm not going to explain it all, but there are a series of events that happened at this park, all in the same time frame, that are beyond belief and beyond explanation, that you'll never hear about anywhere else. And unless somebody went there like us and did something stupid like spent days scouring the archive, you'd never hear about it. But it all seems too coincidental that all of these series of events and all of these missing people all occurred within this Rocky Mountain district in a time frame that doesn't make any sense. So there's another cluster of missing. And as you look at the U.S., I mean, there's people missing in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and when you think, well, people disappearing in a desert, that seems pretty odd. Yeah, it does seem pretty odd. And when you read the stories, it even seems more odd. So don't think mountaintops or mountainsides or hillsides are exclusive. It's the same thing in deserts, too.
Some of your most extraordinary cases involve people who have been found alive, and what they have said and are not said about what happened to them. Could you tell us about some of those cases?
So many of the people that disappear, and I believe it's an unusual amount per the occurrence of the missing, have a disability. And many of those people with a disability have a speech disability that's in conjunction with that. So they can't really explain what happened. And many times it appears to be an autistic disability, but other times it's just age. A lot of the kids that disappear are so young that they can't tell what happened. And in the instances where they should be able to tell what happened, many times they say, I can't remember. And I'm one of these kind of guys that's maybe a mile wide and an inch deep, but I read a lot, and I've read a lot of your work and other researchers, and many of the times it reminds me of the thought process that goes with somebody who's abducted. Initially, they don't remember, but under hypnosis, the recollection comes back to them. And I've always wondered that if I sat down with this group of people and we put them under hypnosis, if they could tell us something that may be quite shocking.
Well, yeah, I think they might be able to. Now, we're going to take another little break here, and when we get back, we're going to be talking about children in a lot more detail. One of the most unique things about the Dreamland Festival is our psychic medium, Marla Fries, who reads the room cold. She simply talks to people in the room, and it is often quite an amazing experience. So, Marla, what are you going to be doing this year?
Well, Whitley, it's been my experience that my personal agenda about how I want my talk to go at the Dreamland Festival goes right out the window when I get there. You see, it's my job to surrender to Spirit's message, not just the messages from our deceased loved ones, but the psychic messages that I hear from the God source, the universal force and consciousness connected to us all. You know, I start listening to the messages before my talk that morning. Right after breakfast, I take notes down, messages, and you know, they're not just for the attendees, but sometimes they're even for the presenters. You remember last year the information that came in about sacred geometry and its meaning? Well, that message wasn't understood until after my talk, when Linda Moulton Howe's presentation, right after me, was about those sacred geometric symbols that were found on the drones. So I invite those who are coming to the festival, and perhaps those who now feel compelled to come, to open their hearts and minds to the possibility of receiving some information about any aspect of their lives, their home, their work, job, health, relationship, even their animals. I trust that our deceased loved ones, as well as spirit, will share profound messages with all of us, and I can't wait.
Oh, Marla, it sounds so exciting. I'll never forget the time you were talking to a man there, and you suddenly began to address him as if he was somebody's daughter, and it turned out he'd had a sex change operation.
Yes, he had had a sex change. That's correct, Whitley. Well,
he didn't look like a woman at all.
No, not at all. Well, as you know, these experiences can be pretty staggering, pretty profound, and I'm just excited.
Well, thanks very much, Marla Fries, and we'll see you at the Dreamland Festival. Folks, if you're going to come to the Dreamland Festival, you'd better hurry because it always sells out. Go to unknowncountry.com. Get your tickets now. You'll find the store's order point on the upper right hand of the homepage. One of the most disturbing features of this whole thing is missing children, and there are a lot of cases in Missing 411, and I was most appalled by the insensitivity of the National Park Service's unwillingness even to document some of these cases. But we've been there. We know the NPS is failing in its fundamental duty to the American people. We've done that. They do not care, but they're bureaucrats. Why would they? They don't care. I won't go on. Okay. Let's talk now about children and some of these disappearances, Dave, found miles and miles from the original location of the disappearance. Maybe some of them never found, some of them heard screaming it just a few feet away from their parents and then never found again. Can you tell us about some of these cases where the children are actually heard during the process of their disappearance?
Yeah, and in fact, you just hit on a couple of them that are just huge in my mind. I mean, the screams and et cetera are so bothersome that it's unusual. The first one that comes to mind is a boy named Keith Parkins. He disappeared in April 1952 from a rural area in eastern Oregon named Ritter, Oregon. Keith was 2 years old, and his family was visiting his grandparents. And, you know, when you visit your grandparents, you run around the yard, have fun, see the animals. Well, his grandfather owned a small ranch, and during that brief time they were there, at one point Keith disappeared. And this is in a pretty rural area with some pretty big mountains, not huge mountains, but kind of between a hill and a mountain. And Keith disappeared, and people start looking for him. And make a long story short, 19 hours after Keith disappeared, and 12 miles north, over 3 sets of mountains, countless fences, they found Keith laying in a dry creek bed, unconscious. And he had a severe case of exposure. His clothes was ripped to shreds. And some of the articles that I read about this defy any conventional explanation. They said, well, the boy must have been running nonstop for 19 hours.
And how old was he again? Just
2 years old. Okay.
So we accept that. He ran continuously for 19 hours at the age of 2, and he'd been walking, for at least a year, so why not?
Yeah, for anybody who's had, in the book I say this, anyone who's had a child, think about how far a 2-year-old can really move.
Yeah. Maybe a quarter of a mile at the outside.
Especially through the mountains and over fences and through creeks and rivers and...
Maybe 500 feet.
Yes.
But not 19 miles.
So Keith was found by a professional searcher and his father. Now, when we discuss this case, again, I go back to the group mentality and how everyone comes up with things. Right away, one of the guys said, you know what's really unusual about this? is why in the heck were these searchers out 12 miles when this kid's been missing less than 24 hours? That makes no sense. And that doesn't make any sense. It's almost as though someone somewhere knew something unusual to be out that far. There's no way you should be more than 2-3 miles away at 24 hours at the very maximum with a kid under 10 years old in that kind of terrain.
Remember, folks, we're talking to a police officer here. This is a man who knows what he's talking about. Go ahead.
So, I mean, one of my questions, if I was one of the law enforcement guys, and I would say, why were you guys 4 or 5 times the distance out that any search and rescue quadrant direction would ever state that you should be? Yeah, it's a miracle you found your boy. God bless you. But why were you out there? Tell me the mentality that sent you there.
Yeah. And, of course, we don't get any answer to that question.
You know, occurred 60 years ago. Who knows, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's too late now, and no one ever asked him. So, and yet, you know, there are a lot of witness disappearances, too. Could you tell us about some of these cases?
Well, one other case, if you don't mind, Willie, I wanted to talk about was...
oh, sure. Go right ahead. If I go off your track, go right back on. That's how we work here.
We were talking about the boys and how they disappeared under strange circumstances. There's a case out of the Northern Cascades where a mom and a son were picking berries in the middle of the woods, and these people were in the middle of the woods, and as they're picking the berries, the mom's maybe 50, 75 feet, not in line of sight of their son, but they hear a scream. The woman starts to run towards the direction of the scream, and the scream gets further away, and it's a more muffled scream the second time. She runs faster, and barely a third scream, but the kid's never found. Now, this is a Native American woman, so they bring in a tribe of Native American searchers, and they never find the boy. And for people that don't, this occurred decades and decades ago. For people that don't understand, if it was my son that's missing, I want Native American trackers on it because these guys were some of the best in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
They look for subtleties that most searchers don't look for, animal signs, tracks, etc. Well, they didn't find any animal tracks. They didn't find anything, and they never found the boy. Now, what's interesting is you fast forward 30 years, there's a boy that was in a camper near Wenatchee Lake, again in this same area, probably no more than 20 miles away from where Pankinen, the berry picker, disappeared. This boy was in the back of a camper with their cat and his younger sister. This boy again was sleeping, and the parents were just walking through the woods and kind of enjoying the sight. And originally they were there to hunt. So they kept the camper in view at all times. They wanted to make sure that they didn't get too far away. And this was October 1973. His name was Jimmy Duffy. He was 2 years old. And they walked behind a set of trees just momentarily, and they hear a scream. And they run from behind the trees, and they see the camper door open. They run as fast as they can, and they get up to the back of the door, and they look inside. The daughter is still asleep, and the cat is still asleep. And Jimmy is gone. So, again, I write to the sheriff's office, I explain what we're doing, and I ask for copies of the report. They never had any copies. They said, wow, we don't even know anything about this case. He must have been found. I said, well, the best we can tell, he's never been found. So they go back into their archives, and they search, and 2 months later, they come up with the case, and they say, you're right, he's never been found. Thanks for doing this. And they mail me copies of the report. Well, the sheriff's office, right from the onset, started to accuse the parents of killing the boy and disposing of him. And they laid on this for 2 or 3 weeks in the reports. And, God, I felt bad for the parents because eventually they sent him to Seattle police. The parents took polygraphs, and they were completely exonerated. And what's unnerving about it is not only they lost a lot of time on the case, but law enforcement, there's no way that they understand that this has been going on right in that Wenatchee, Northern Cascades area for 60, 70 years under the exact scenario I just gave you.
It's not a normal case of a serial kidnapper or serial killer. It's been going on for that long, obviously.
Exactly. No, it couldn't be, right?
No. Are there any consistencies in terms of the areas? For example, any unusual factors in these areas where the disappearances cluster, aside from the fact that they're wilderness areas? I'm talking about things like magnetic anomalies or anything unusual out of the ordinary at all.
You know, the one thing that we hit on a lot is that the places where these people disappeared in the north, there's many bodies of water nearby for whatever that relationship meant. And whether it's next to a river, lots of lakes, lots of small lakes, lots of creeks, whatever. Now, on the magnetic anomalies, that would be a great question. But again, it's something that can't be readily addressed unless you spent hours and hours right in those areas researching it, and we just didn't have the time to do it. In other areas of disappearances, and this is going to sound strange, but in high elevation disappearances, and there are many in the book, boulder fields seem to play a predominant role when people disappear and are never found. And I can't quite explain the boulder field phenomena other than it exists.
Of course, there's a very famous case in Australia, the Hanging Rock case, where a group of young women disappeared in what amounts to a boulder field. It's more like a maze of boulders. They were just never found again.
Yeah.
Never. Not a trace. There's a movie about it called Picnic at Hanging Rock, which will, if you haven't seen it, Dave, I wouldn't recommend it. I think it'd scare you too badly. But it's quite a powerful movie. David, yes. We have come to the end of our time together on Dreamland. But folks, I want you to stay with us because we're going deeper in the subscriber area where there is, speaking of clusters, a cluster of you who either take an interest in the close encounter phenomenon or have had it happen to you, and who may have cases like this in your own families and in your own pasts. But even if not, do subscribe to unknowncountry.com, and above all, get a copy of Missing 411. The second volume's coming out shortly. The first volume, Western United States and Canada, is available now. Is it available for Kindle and ebooks or just in hard copy?
You know, it's just in hard copy right now at Can-Am, Canadian American, canammissing.com. At
canammissing.com. Okay, and you know, I have to tell you, just upon a personal basis, a book like this, you need the hard copy. And the reason you do is it's so full of information. You can just flip so easily from page to page, case after case, and go back to cases. It's much harder to do that on an e-reader. So, folks, it's I would get it in actual book format in any case, whether it's out on Kindle and Nook and so forth or not. Dave, thank you so much for spending your time with us on Dreamland. And for you subscribers, we're going to go right on with this in the subscriber area of unknowncountry.com.
You've been listening to Dreamland. Be sure to tune in again next week. Dreamland is brought to you by unknowncountry.com and our family of subscribers. Our news editor is Ann Strieber. Our science reporter is Linda Moulton Howe. Our webmaster is Daniel Stiegel. And I'm your Dreamland announcer, Brian Arnold. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
Found on the Northern California coast up near Crescent City.
Yeah. You know, you're talking to somebody who worries a lot about disappearances for obvious reasons, having been involved with this strange phenomena for so long. Well, let's go back to the Highway of Tears. And if this has been going on now for quite a long time along this specific stretch of road in British Columbia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, interestingly enough, there was one of the most carefully documented alien abductions that ever happened was quite near there in the Okanagan. So you have to wonder what is actually going on out there. Tell us a little bit about some of the cases along the highway.
You know, many are First Nations people, and to me that's an interesting phenomenon because I've always been interested in Native Americans and their culture and their legends and things. And these people tend to be comfortable out in the wild or out in the wilderness or along a roadway alone where maybe you and I wouldn't be. Maybe that makes them more susceptible, maybe it doesn't. Many of these victims have been women. There's literally been almost no witnesses. There's been a lot of rumors that they may have a suspect on one or two of these cases and maybe a serial predator. I think they're hoping for a big break on the case, but I think in reality there's very little information. And when you look on these serial cases, these people don't talk to others. They're very quiet about what they do for obvious reasons. They're unique people. A lot of times they're good-looking people. So if it is a serial predator, you know, they could be good for 20 or 30.
There was an extraordinary author on Coast to Coast AM, David Paulides. I'm sure a lot of you heard the program. I certainly did. I was absolutely riveted, and I wanted immediately to have David on Dreamland, and he's here with us today. David's book, Missing 411, Western United States and Canada, available now from his website, CanamMissing.com. The Eastern United States, out later this month. Very exciting and extraordinary stuff. We're going to go deeper into some new cases that have just developed over the course of Dreamland. And for subscribers, we're going to get into some very, very extraordinary new material, new evidence involving Bigfoot, suggesting Bigfoot may not be a great ape at all. And also for subscribers, David and I are going to talk about one of the most incredible missing persons cases in all of history. It took place in Indonesia a few years ago. You can read about it on unknowncountry.com. Just follow the links on the Dreamland page. And for you subscribers, you can listen to me talking to Alan Lammers, who was a direct witness of this extraordinary case in Indonesia. Now, I'm very excited to introduce David Paulides to my Dreamland audience. David, welcome to this radio program. And I'd like to start with one of the strangest cases. It's been ongoing for a number of years, of feet found in shoes, just feet, on the shores of British Columbia. David, could you tell us a little bit more about these cases?
Been going there my whole life. I understand it. I also understand there's been a lot of disappearances there, some really unusual disappearances. So we filed the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, against the Park Service asking for a list of missing people from Yosemite. And I'm not the greatest writer in the world, but I tend to get my point across. And the Park Service came back and stated that they didn't have any list of missing people. Well, one of the people that I work with is the head of a large statewide law enforcement jurisdiction. This guy has over 40 years of law enforcement experience. He's a former director. He knows his stuff. When we got this letter back, this guy said, Dave, these people are not stupid. They have lists. Try rewriting it a different way so you can get around any semantical issues, but you know they have the lists. We rewrote it, sent it back. The Western Regional Director for FOIA for the Park Service came back and said, no, Dave, we understood your request. We have no list of missing people. We don't have them at the park level, and we don't have them at the national level for all the parks. And I said, well, how can that be? A politically sensitive issue like this. And her response, and I quote it in the book, is that we rely on the institutional memory of our employees to help us on missing people and to understand the magnitude of it at different parks. So I thought, oh, perfect. So I sent a request back again saying that I was a published author and I requested an exemption and I wanted the list of missing people utilizing what you just quoted. I got a response back that they would have to go into the archives and form a list, and it would cost me $34,000 for the list from Yosemite.
Just from Yosemite?
Just Yosemite.
Which means it must be a fairly big list. I mean, $34,000 is a lot of money, but you're going to be talking
30 of these. But again, these numbers are high. I think in some instances along that could be attributed to this Highway of Tears, it could be upwards of 60, 70 people.
That would make it one of the most terrible of all serial killer cases in world history, actually. It would be right up there with the top.
Absolutely.
And how long has it been going on?
I believe it's been going on over 20 years.
Well, that's very scary and very, very weird. One of the things about the book, bureaucrats make my blood boil, and I'm not alone in this, in the world. In fact, when people are actually bureaucrats, I think they conceal their jobs so that they won't get attacked by almost anyone they see. But bureaucrats have had quite a role to play in your effort to get into this and to understand what is actually happening in our national park system. Could you describe a little bit about your experiences with the National Park Service?
And here in Whitley goes to the heart of what these two books are about. Several years ago, I got some information about disappearances in the park system. A couple of people told me that they had worked at several different parks and they had seen people go missing, and they thought that the Park Service was being maybe not as reticent and not as forward, maybe holding back information to the public as they should be as a public agency, and they thought that there seemed to be too many of these disappearances in certain locations. And they said that somebody really needs to take a hard look at this. Well, we did, and there were four of us that worked on this for a little over 3 years. The first thing we did was one of the parks closest to me is Yosemite. Well, British Columbia is a unique location because there have been literally dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have disappeared there along a route called the Highway of Tears. It's in the interior of British Columbia. And it wasn't until just recently that the RCMP put a task force together to really look at the issue. And many people have disappeared hitchhiking, some in their front lawn area, some in the forest. Along the coastal route, there's been many disappearances along the same sort of format. But along the coast of British Columbia down all the way to Northern California, there have been feet found in shoes, predominantly in tennis shoes. And I don't know that the RCMP really has a good handle on this yet. There have been rumors that these are suicides, but it seems odd that just feet in shoes are showing up. And again, I don't know. Well,
what a strange thing to decide. Suicide? What? Feet in shoes and they're suicides?
It seems odd, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I would say so. The theory being what? Why did just their feet show up after they committed suicide?
That no one said. It seems like it was just a flippant response, maybe to soothe the public about the issue. But I think that the best that I've heard is that one shoe and 1 foot was identified, and that belonged to somebody who was quote-unquote despondent, but there was no words of suicide with this person. And interestingly, they didn't even name the person. So very little information is out there about this.
That's really, really strange. And yet has it happened in the past year or so at all? Or
I think the last shoe was just about a year ago.